My name is Ethan Cole, and if you'd asked me a week ago, I'd have said I had a good life. At 36, I was married to Sophie, the woman I'd fallen for the moment I met her at a coffee shop 10 years ago. We had a cozy home in the suburbs, no kids yet, but plenty of plans for the future. I worked in IT, Sophie in marketing, and together we'd built a life that felt steady, solid. That illusion shattered last Thursday. It started innocently enough. I was cleaning out the garage, sifting through boxes of old books, papers, and photo albums. Sophie was at work, and I thought I'd surprise her by finally tackling the clutter she always complained about. About an hour in, I came across a small, dusty box labeled Memories. I smiled, recognizing Sophie's handwriting. Inside, I found ticket stubs, postcards, and small mementos from our travels over the years. At the bottom of the box was a small leather journal I didn't recognize. It was worn, the pages yellowed at the edges. Curious, I opened it. The first few entries were from our honeymoon in Santorini, Greece. Sophie had always loved to write, and it was sweet to see her thoughts from that time. She described the sunsets, the food, and how happy she was to start our life together. I smiled, my heart warming as I read her words. But then I turned the page. The tone shifted. Sophie described meeting someone, a man named Caleb, at a small cafe in Oya. At first, the entry seemed harmless. She mentioned how they struck up a conversation about books, how he made her laugh with his stories about traveling. But as I read further, my stomach began to churn. It felt strange seeing him again after all this time. Part of me wanted to run, but part of me wanted to stay. I don't know what I was thinking, agreeing to meet him that night. My hands shook as I flipped to the next entry. I told myself it would just be dinner, a chance to catch up, nothing more. But when he smiled at me, it was like no time had passed. We talked for hours and I forgot about everything else. About Ethan, about my vows. When he kissed me, I didn't stop him. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. My heart pounded in my chest as I reread the words, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there it was, written in Sophie's own hand. She had met Caleb, her ex-boyfriend, the one she'd told me she hadn't spoken to in years, on our honeymoon. And she hadn't just met him. She'd kissed him. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. Sophie was loyal, devoted, the kind of person who always did the right thing. This couldn't be her. But the words in that journal told a different story. When Sophie came home that evening, I couldn't look at her the same way. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her smile as bright as ever. "The garage looks amazing," she said, glancing at the neatly stacked boxes. "Thanks," I mumbled, avoiding her gaze. She frowned, stepping closer. "Are you okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," I said quickly. Too quickly. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't push. "Well, dinner's almost ready. Come sit." As we ate, I couldn't focus on the conversation. My mind was stuck on that journal, on the image of her and Caleb together while I'd been none the wiser. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I wasn't ready. I needed to know more. That night, as Sophie slept soundly beside me, I went back to the journal. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, scanning for more mentions of Caleb. I told Caleb it couldn't happen again, that it was a mistake. He understood, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. Part of me hated myself for hurting him. Part of me hated myself for wanting him. I gritted my teeth, bile rising in my throat. She had considered it, thought about him, even after what happened, but what I read next made my blood run cold. He asked if we could stay in touch. Just as friends, he said. I know it's dangerous, but I couldn't say no. I gave him my email before we said goodbye. It felt like I was closing a door, but part of me knew it wasn't fully shut. I closed the journal, my breathing ragged. My mind spun with questions. Had she stayed in touch with him? Had their mistake been more than just a one-time lapse in judgment? I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many other secrets Sophie might be keeping. The next morning, as Sophie sat at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone, I felt a surge of determination. I couldn't let this fester any longer. I needed answers. "Hey," I said, sitting across from her. She looked up, her expression softening. "Morning. You okay? You didn't sleep well." "I found something yesterday. I said, keeping my voice steady. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? In the garage, I continued. A journal. Your journal. Her face went pale. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on hers. Do you want to tell me about Caleb? The air between us felt like it thickened with tension the moment I said his name. Sophie froze, her expression morphing from confusion to something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Guilt? Caleb, she repeated softly, almost like she was testing the word. Yes, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. Your ex. The one you said you hadn't spoken to in years. The one you met on our honeymoon. Her face went pale and she set her coffee mug down with trembling hands. Ethan, I can explain. Don't, I said sharply, cutting her off. Don't give me some rehearsed line. I read your journal, Sophie. I know what happened. I know you kissed him. I know you gave him your email. What I don't know is how long you've been lying to me. She flinched at my words, her eyes welling with tears. I didn't mean for you to find that, she whispered. That's what you're worried about? That I found it? My voice rose, the anger bubbling to the surface. You should be worried about the fact that you've been keeping this from me for years. I didn't want to hurt you, she said quickly, her voice breaking. Too late for that, I shot back, pushing my chair back and standing up. I couldn't sit still. I started pacing the kitchen, running a hand through my hair. How long, Sophie? How long have you been in touch with him? She wiped at her tears, her lips trembling. A few months after the honeymoon, she admitted. We exchanged a few emails. It wasn't anything serious. Just catching up. Catching up? I repeated bitterly. You think I care how casual it was? You reached out to him after kissing him on our honeymoon. You lied to me then, and you've been lying to me ever since. She stood up, her voice pleading now. I ended it, Ethan. I told him I couldn't keep talking to him, that it wasn't fair to you, and I haven't spoken to him since. I stopped pacing, turning to face her. Do you expect me to believe that? That after everything, you just decided to walk away? Yes, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Because it's the truth. I made a mistake. A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But I ended it. I chose you, Ethan. I've always chosen you. Her words should have comforted me, but they didn't. They felt hollow, like an attempt to put a Band-Aid on a wound that was already festering. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. My voice softer now, but no less hurt. If you ended it, if it was over, why not tell me the truth? Because I knew it would destroy you, she said, fresh tears streaming down her face. I knew how much it would hurt you to know that I'd done what I did. And I was ashamed, Ethan. I've spent years trying to forget it ever happened. I shook my head, letting out a bitter laugh. You've spent years trying to forget, but I've spent years living a lie. Do you have any idea how that feels? To think you know someone, only to find out they've been keeping something like this from you? She took a step closer, her hands outstretched as if she wanted to reach for me, but didn't dare. I know I can't undo what I've done, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I love you, Ethan. I've always loved you. And I swear, Caleb doesn't mean anything to me anymore. I stared at her, the woman I'd built my life with, and felt a pang of sadness so deep it almost knocked the wind out of me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this was just a mistake, a lapse in judgment that we could somehow move past. But the betrayal felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. I need to know everything, I said finally, my voice trembling. No more secrets, no more lies. I need to know exactly what happened between you and Caleb. Every detail. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head. Ethan, please, don't make me relive it. You owe me that much, aren't I said, my tone sharper now. If you want any chance of fixing this, you need to tell me the truth. All of it. She nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Okay, she whispered. I'll tell you everything. We sat at the kitchen table, the tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Sophie took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I didn't expect to see Caleb in Santorini, she began. It wasn't planned. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and then, there he was, sitting at that cafe. He recognized me first. He came over, we started talking, and it felt familiar, comfortable. Her voice cracked, and she paused to collect herself. We agreed to meet again that night, just to catch up. I told myself it was harmless. But when we were alone, it was like all these old feelings came rushing back. And then he kissed me. I clenched my jaw, my hands balling into fists under the table. I stopped him, she said quickly. I told him it was wrong, that I couldn't do it, and he apologized. He said he just wanted to stay in touch, and I gave him my email. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. We emailed for a few months, but it was never about anything serious. I never saw him again after that night. Do you regret it? I asked, my voice cold. Yes, she said without hesitation. Every single day. Her answer hung in the air, and I wasn't sure if it was enough. The house was unbearably quiet after Sophie finished telling me everything. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and most confusing of all, a flicker of longing for the life I thought we had. Sophie's hands trembled as they rested on the edge of the table. She kept glancing at me as if she were trying to read my mind, but I refused to meet her gaze. Her confession felt like a chasm had opened between us, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be bridged. You said you haven't spoken to him since those emails, I said finally, breaking the silence. How do I know that's true? Her breath caught, and she looked at me with desperation. Because it is true, Ethan. I swear it. I blocked his email years ago. I haven't heard from him since. Years ago, I repeated, my tone bitter. You've had years to tell me about this, and you didn't. Why? She flinched, her tears beginning to spill again. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid you'd leave me. Afraid you'd never look at me the same way again. And I didn't want to lose you, Ethan. I still don't. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to lash out, to make her feel the same pain she'd caused me. But what good would that do? The damage was already done. I stood, pushing my chair back roughly. I need some air, I said, my voice tight. Ethan, please. I'll be back, I interrupted, grabbing my keys. I need to think. I drove aimlessly, the streets blurring together as my thoughts spiraled. Sophie's words echoed in my mind. I didn't want to lose you. I still don't. The thing was, I didn't know if I wanted to lose her either. As much as her betrayal hurt, the thought of walking away from our life together, our history, our plans, our love, felt just as unbearable. Eventually, I pulled into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town. It was a place we'd gone to often when we first started dating, back when everything felt simple and pure. I sat on a bench overlooking the pond, staring at the rippling water as I tried to untangle the mess in my head. I thought about Caleb, the man who had somehow inserted himself into our marriage without me even knowing. Did he ever wonder about me? Did he ever feel guilty for what he'd done? Or was I just a shadow in the background of whatever fantasy he and Sophie had shared? But the truth was, Caleb wasn't the problem. Sophie was the one who had made the choice to meet him, to keep in touch with him, to lie to me for years. Caleb might have been the catalyst, but the betrayal was hers. By the time I got home, the sky had darkened and the house was quiet. Sophie was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Did you think? She asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I said, standing in the middle of the room, unsure whether to sit or keep my distance. She unfolded herself and stood, taking a tentative step toward me. Ethan, I'll do anything to fix this, she said, her voice trembling. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just tell me what you need. I let out a long breath, running a hand through my hair. I don't know what I need right now, Sophie, I admitted, but I know I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I'm not asking you to pretend, she said quickly. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you to give me a chance to make it right. Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who stayed up late with me, talking about our dreams for the future. But that woman felt so far away now, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. Do you still love me? I asked, my voice cracking. She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. Of course I do, she said, her voice firm despite her tears. I've always loved you, Ethan. Even when I made the worst mistake of my life, it didn't change how I felt about you. It never has. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But how could I? How could I trust the words of someone who had spent years hiding the truth? I need time, I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. Time to figure out what I want. What we want. Sophie nodded, though I could see the pain in her eyes. Take all the time you need, she said softly. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Her words should have brought me comfort, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. That night I slept on the couch. Or, rather, I tried to. The hours ticked by as I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything Sophie had told me. I thought about the life we'd built together, the love we'd shared, and the betrayal that now overshadowed it all. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The life we had before was gone. And whether we could build something new in its place was a question I wasn't ready to answer. The morning after I slept on the couch, the house felt eerily quiet. Sophie didn't come downstairs until I was already at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She paused in the doorway, her hair disheveled and her face still puffy from crying. Morning, she said softly, her voice tentative. Morning, I replied, not looking up. She walked over to the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was trying not to upset the fragile balance of the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Finally, she broke it. Ethan, she began, her voice trembling, I know things aren't going to be the same for a long time, but I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild your trust. I stared down at my mug, her words bouncing off the walls of my mind. You've said that, I replied, my tone neutral. I mean it, she said, taking a cautious step closer. I've already started looking into couples counseling. I can set up an appointment for us whenever you're ready. Counseling isn't going to erase what you did, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I know that, she said quickly. But it's a start, isn't it? We need to start somewhere. I looked up at her for the first time that morning, taking in the raw emotion on her face. She looked broken, vulnerable, like she was holding herself together with sheer willpower. Part of me wanted to soften, to comfort her, but the hurt in my chest kept me rooted in place. I don't even know if I want to start, I admitted, my voice low. I don't know if I can. Her breath hitched and she set her coffee down on the counter, her hands trembling. You don't mean that, she whispered. I don't know what I mean, I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. I need to clear my head. I spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. Every corner of my mind was consumed by questions I didn't have answers to. Was Sophie truly sorry, or was she just desperate to keep our life intact? Could I ever trust her again? Did I even want to? At some point, I ended up at Adam's house. Adam was my closest friend, someone I'd known since high school, and the only person I felt comfortable confiding in. He opened the door, his brow furrowed with concern when he saw my face. Ethan? What's going on? Can I come in? I asked, my voice strained. Of course, he said, stepping aside. We sat in his living room, and I told him everything. About the journal, Sophie's confession, Caleb, and the years of lies. By the time I finished, my voice was hoarse, and my hands were shaking. Adam let out a low whistle, leaning back in his chair. Man, that's a lot, he said. I'm sorry you're going through this. Thanks, I muttered, staring down at the floor. What are you going to do? He asked after a moment. I don't know, I admitted. She says she's willing to do anything to fix this, but I don't even know if it's fixable. How do you come back from something like this? Adam was silent for a moment, then said, It depends on what you want, Ethan. Do you still love her? The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. I don't know, I said honestly. I think I do, but it's hard to separate love from everything else. Adam nodded, his expression thoughtful. Look, man, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if you think there's even a chance you can forgive her, you owe it to yourself to explore that. If not, then you need to be honest with her and with yourself. His words stayed with me as I drove home that evening, the weight of my decision pressing down on me like a lead blanket. When I walked through the door, Sophie was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest and a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with hope and fear. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey," I replied, setting my keys on the counter. I sat down across from her, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "I've been thinking," I began, my voice steady but heavy. She nodded, her hands tightening around the blanket. "And? And I don't have all the answers yet," I admitted, "but I'm willing to try. For now." Her eyes widened, and she let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered. "I swear, Ethan, I'll do everything I can to make this right. But there are conditions," I continued, my tone firm. "First, no more secrets, ever. If you're feeling anything, even if you think it'll hurt me, you tell me. Understood?" She nodded quickly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Understood. Second, we go to counseling. Together. No excuses, no delays." "Absolutely," she said, her voice trembling. "And third," I said, leaning forward, "this is your one and only chance, Sophie. If I ever find out you've lied to me again, we're done. No discussions, no second chances. Do you understand?" "I understand," she said, her tears falling freely now. "Thank you, Ethan. Thank you for giving me this chance." I nodded, leaning back in my chair. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you," I said. "That's going to take time. A lot of time." "I know," she said softly. "And I'll wait as long as it takes." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling as Sophie slept beside me. The road ahead felt daunting, and I wasn't sure if we'd make it to the other side. But for the first time since I found that journal, I felt a sliver of hope, fragile and faint, but real. The next few days were a blur of cautious attempts at normalcy. Sophie seemed determined to follow through on her promises. She booked a marriage counselor, deleted all her old social media accounts, and even handed me her phone without hesitation, saying, "You can check it whenever you want." Her actions should have reassured me, but they didn't. Not entirely. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. It's fragile, like a mirror that's been shattered and glued back together. Even if it looks whole from a distance, the cracks remain. Emily, our close friend who worked as a therapist, gave us one piece of advice when I confided in her. "You need to decide if this is about salvaging your marriage or finding closure, because they're not the same thing." That thought stayed with me. I wasn't sure which I wanted yet, salvage or closure. But for now, I kept moving forward, one step at a time. The first counseling session was harder than I expected. Sitting across from Sophie in that sterile room, with a stranger dissecting our marriage, felt surreal. Our counselor, a middle-aged woman named Karen, started by asking us to share why we were there. I let Sophie speak first. "I'm here because I betrayed my husband," she said, her voice trembling. "I lied to him, and I broke his trust, and I want to do everything I can to fix what I've broken." Karen nodded, then turned to me. "And you, Ethan?" I hesitated, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair. "I'm here because I need answers," I said finally. "I need to understand why she did what she did, and I need to figure out if this marriage is worth saving." Sophie flinched at my words, but she didn't argue. Karen leaned forward, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "It sounds like you're both in a lot of pain," she said gently. "This process is going to take time and a lot of honesty from both of you. Are you prepared for that?" Sophie nodded immediately, her eyes glistening with tears. I hesitated before nodding as well. "Good," Karen said. "Then let's start with the hardest question. Sophie, why did you do it?" Sophie's breath hitched, and she wiped at her eyes. "I've asked myself that question so many times," she said softly. "And the truth is, I was scared. Scared of how much I loved Ethan. Scared of committing to forever. When I saw Caleb on our honeymoon, it felt like a piece of my old life was staring back at me, tempting me to hold on to the past." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd always thought our honeymoon was perfect. Sunsets, laughter, the start of a beautiful life together. To hear her describe it as a moment of doubt felt like reliving the betrayal all over again. Karen must have noticed my reaction because she interjected, "Ethan, how does hearing that make you feel?" "Angry," I said, my voice tight. "Hurt, like the life I thought we were building was a lie." "It wasn't a lie," Sophie said quickly, her voice desperate. Ethan, everything we've built since then has been real. I was scared in that moment, but I chose you. I've always chosen you. I looked at her, searching her face for sincerity. Her eyes pleaded with me, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than anger. Over the next few sessions, Karen guided us through the tangled mess of our emotions. We talked about the ways we drifted apart over the years, my long hours at work, Sophie's growing sense of isolation, and how those cracks had led to her choices. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to walk out, moments when the pain felt too raw to confront. But Sophie never wavered. She faced every hard truth, answered every painful question, and never once tried to shift the blame. One night after a particularly grueling session, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ethan, but I hope one day I can earn it." Her honesty disarmed me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. One day as I was cleaning the house, I found Sophie's journal again. It was tucked away in a drawer, almost as if she'd forgotten about it. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I wanted to revisit the pain it had caused. But when I flipped through the pages, I saw something unexpected. At the very back of the journal in fresh ink was a new entry. "I'm writing this because I need to remember what I almost lost. Ethan is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I can't believe I nearly destroyed us. Every day I wake up grateful for the chance to make things right. I hope I can be the wife he deserves." Her words caught me off guard. They weren't written for me to see. They were private, raw, and unfiltered. And for the first time, I believed her remorse was real. That night I showed Sophie the journal. Her face turned red when she realized I'd read the new entry. "I didn't mean for you to see that," she said softly. "I'm glad I did," I replied, "because it helped me see that maybe you really are trying." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand. "I'll never stop trying, Ethan. I promise you that." The road ahead was still uncertain, and the wounds Sophie had caused wouldn't heal overnight. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that we could rebuild what had been broken. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick. But maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. The days following my discovery of Sophie's new journal entry were different. The house was still quiet, the air still heavy with the weight of her betrayal, but something had shifted. Sophie was no longer walking on eggshells, trying to avoid my anger. Instead, she was patient, consistent, and unflinchingly honest. I wasn't sure if that was enough. A part of me wanted to believe her, that her remorse was genuine, that she had made a mistake and was now doing everything she could to atone for it. But another part of me, the part still raw and angry, kept reminding me of the lies, the years of deceit, the journal she had hidden, the memories she had buried. I spent my nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, playing out every possible scenario in my mind. Could I forgive her? Could I trust her again? And even if I could, did I want to? The following Saturday, Sophie and I sat in the counselor's office for what was supposed to be our final session. Karen had guided us through weeks of painful conversations, forcing us to confront the cracks in our marriage that had allowed this to happen. "I think you've both done a lot of work," Karen said, her voice calm but firm. "But now it's time to decide where you go from here. Ethan, how do you feel about the progress you've made?" I hesitated, glancing at Sophie. She was watching me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could see the fear in her eyes, the worry that I might decide it wasn't enough. "I think," I began, my voice faltering. "I think I've realized that I still love Sophie. But loving her doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't erase the betrayal or the hurt." Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's true. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means deciding whether or not you're willing to move forward, knowing what you know now." She turned to Sophie. "Sophie, what would moving forward look like for you?" Sophie took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill. "It would mean rebuilding trust every single day, being honest even when it's hard, showing Ethan, not just telling him, that I'm committed to him and our marriage, and accepting that it's going to take time for him to heal." Karen nodded again, then looked back at me. "Ethan, the decision is yours. Do you want to continue this journey together, or do you feel it's time to let go? The drive home was silent. Sophie didn't press me for answers. She didn't even ask how I felt about the session. She just sat quietly in the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap. When we pulled into the driveway, I turned off the car but didn't get out right away. Sophie looked at me, waiting. "I've made my decision," I said finally, my voice steady. Her breath hitched, and she turned fully toward me. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm staying," I said, meeting her gaze. "But this is going to take time, a lot of time, and it's not going to be easy for either of us." Her tears spilled over, and she reached for my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving us a chance." I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't squeeze hers either. "Don't thank me yet," I said quietly. "We still have a long way to go." Over the next few weeks, Sophie and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. She stuck to her promises, attending counseling, being open about her thoughts and feelings, and giving me space when I needed it. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, she looked at me and said, "You don't have to forgive me right now, or ever if you don't want to. But I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn your trust back." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I saw not just her guilt, but her determination. She wasn't trying to sweep this under the rug or pretend it never happened. She was facing it head on, no matter how much it hurt. And slowly, day by day, I started to believe her. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were days when the anger and sadness bubbled to the surface, threatening to undo the progress we'd made. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I'd made the right choice. But then there were moments, small, quiet moments, that reminded me why I'd stayed. The way Sophie smiled when she made me my favorite breakfast. The way she reached for my hand during counseling, her touch gentle and reassuring. The way she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of love, regret, and hope. I didn't know if we would ever get back to the way things were. Maybe we wouldn't. But what I did know was that we were both willing to try. And for now, that was enough. The journal that had once been a symbol of betrayal now sat in a drawer, untouched. I didn't need to look at it anymore. The past was the past, and while it couldn't be erased, it didn't have to define our future. As Sophie and I stood in the kitchen one evening, cooking dinner together, she turned to me and said, "I love you, Ethan, and I'm so sorry for everything." I looked at her, my heart heavy, but full of a cautious hope. "I love you too," I said, "and I'm trying to forgive you, one day at a time." And that's exactly what we did. Took it one day at a time, rebuilding the pieces of our life together, slowly but surely.